Hello, and welcome to Monash Arts. My name is Dr. Zachary Russell. I do prefer to be called Zach, and I am part of the Behavioral Studies team in the School of Social Sciences. And I'm here today to talk to you about one of the most common questions we receive over in behavioral studies. And it's also a really common question that Student Services receives, which is what is the difference between psychology and behavioral studies? And the follow-up question to that is inevitably something along the lines of which one is the right choice for me, or how do I know what to choose? So just to tell you a little bit about who I am so you can have some confidence in what I'm telling you here. As I mentioned, I'm part of the Behavioral Studies team. My role is within the Behavioral Studies team. In the in-classroom level, I'm a lecturer and unit coordinator. I'm also running workshops and am a chief examiner. But my primary focus is on lecturing and unit coordination. I am also the current minor coordinator for behavioral studies. It is currently being offered as a minor in 2025. And in 2026, we're going to introduce behavioral studies as a major, and I will be the coordinator for the program when it's introduced. I also hold a role at the school level, by which I mean the School of Social Sciences, and I am the Deputy Director of Education in charge of student experiences. There is a second Deputy Education Director in charge of sort of teaching and learning. And together we work under the Education Director for the School of Social Sciences. So I am a pretty knowledgeable person about this behavioral studies program and the broader School of Social Sciences and Faculty of Arts structure. And I can tell you quite a bit about the difference between psychology and behavioral studies. However, I want to tell you right now that I can't offer you that sort of magic marker or magic line in the sand where we can create this perfect line where on one side is behavioral studies and on the other side is psychology, and there is no overlap between them. That marker doesn't exist. That line in the sand doesn't exist. The truth is there is a lot of overlap between behavioral studies and psychology. And so I want to talk to you about what those overlaps are, but also talk to you about what the uniquenesses are. To help you make a well-informed choice, because despite the overlaps, there are some considerable differences that do set them apart. But again, circling back to the similarities, it is the case that as a behavioral studies researcher, I commonly interact with psychological researchers. A lot of the materials I teach do come from psychologists, not the majority, but a good chunk of them do. In behavioral studies, it does include a lot of traditional psychology. However, it goes far beyond that and includes many other sort of perspectives as well. And I guess I would say that if you really want to kind of sort of make a connection between behavioral studies and psychology, I would suggest that behavioral studies is quite similar to social psychology as opposed to sort of traditional psychology, or what I often call capital P psychology. It looks at things through a slightly different lens. But this is a bit abstract. Let's talk a little bit more directly here. So both fields do obviously offer unique insights into human behavior. The choice you would make obviously depends on if you're more interested in mental processes or broader behavioral patterns, but perhaps more so which career path you might find yourself on. And we'll kind of talk to you about both of those here in this short video. So to start off with, this is very general. We'll kind of drill down on this in more detail, but if you're quite fascinated by the mind itself, the brain, the different parts of the brain, and you're really interested in helping people one-on-one, especially in a clinical setting, you're very health-focused and really wanting to help people feel better about themselves, work on self-esteem, and, focused on both individual level and community level health. Psychology, traditional psychology is a really, really good choice for you. If you're instead more curious about how the mind and behavior plays out in the context of societies and cultures and the various institutions and agencies that exist within these frameworks, behavioral studies is probably more in your wheelhouse. Again, there's a lot of kind of social psychology there, connecting with society, culture, other elements. Now, that being said, in psychology, psychologists in the traditional sense are not unaware of broader social patterns and are not unaware of social psychology in the behavioral studies perspective. And it's part of what they do. And likewise, behavioral studies is obviously very in tune with traditional psychology because it is very much part of the equation. But they are quite different when we take a step back and look at both the kind of perspective with which we come to the question of human behavior. And also with, again, the career choices that come out of doing the different kinds of studies. So, I will talk to you here very briefly about certain elements and how they differ between psychology and behavioral studies. So, in terms of the main focus, we've kind of mentioned this already. With psychology, there's a lot of focus on the mind, mental processes, and individual behavior. While not being strictly so, it's very much intrapersonal within the self. It's not as focused on interpersonal, like between people, or intergroup between two different groups of people. That's more social psychology, and that would fall more in the domain of behavioral studies. So in terms of the main focus, I would describe behavioral studies along the lines of human behavior in social and cultural contexts. Behavioral studies does also include animal behavior and often animal and human interactions. We've had some fascinating research at Monash about that. So yeah. Now, the core questions that psychologists asks versus behavioral scientists or behavioral studies folks, if you will, psychology would ask why people think, feel, and behave the way they do, and also questions of how well they feel. So behavioral studies, on the other hand, is how and why people behave the way that they do in certain situations across varying contexts. To what extent is behavior dependent on environmental cues and other things that come from outside the individual, outside the realm of the intrapersonal. Now, the typical topics vary a bit between the disciplines. There's major overlap, but there's also differences. These are some of the differences. With psychology, a lot of emphasis on emotions, memory, learning, perception, mental illness, and cultural influences. Several of these things pop up in behavioral studies, but there's not as much emphasis on some of them. With behavioral studies, we're more focused on attitudes, motivations, beliefs, identity, especially when it comes to groups, connecting to one group, groups not getting along with each other. Very interested in social norms, normative influence, socialization processes, behavior patterns, cultural influences, and institutions, and how they kind of play a role in all of this. Now, when it comes to the approach to practicing the discipline, there are again some major differences. With psychology, there's a very, very, very sort of traditional scientific approach, and it's again often very individual focused and clinical. With behavioral studies, it's far more interdisciplinary. It blends psychology with sociology, anthropology, criminology, politics, you name it. In fact, one of my behavioral studies classes is called The Mind, the Self, and Political Behavior, and it's based on the discipline of political psychology. And that's a great example of behavioral studies. Even though the discipline's called political psychology, and it does include many psychologists, you have a lot of, it's argued the discipline is more characterized by social psychologists and behavioral science academics. All right. So another big question that I think a lot of people are going to want to know about choosing which program is whether further study is involved. How far can I get with my bachelor's degree? Now, with psychology, if you want a registered role, if you want to be a psychologist and actually practice in a clinical setting, yes, you will be required to get a master's degree plus a registration. So that bachelor's degree is not going to be enough on its own to provide you access to being a clinical psychologist with accreditation. With a certification and registration. However, with behavioral studies, that is not always the case, that you need further studies. It really depends on the career and the path that you're going down, but there's often less of a clinical focus, so there's not necessarily a need for that degree of specialization. So again, that's the clinical side of things. There are certainly career paths that do open up with an undergraduate psychology degree, but for the people who want to actually practice in a clinical setting, you will need further study beyond the psychology degree to get APA accreditation and certification. All right, so the real world applications, psychologists basically work to understand, explain, and improve human behavior and mental processes. They apply their expertise to enhance individual and societal well-being with a strong focus on mental health across diverse real-world settings. Behavioral studies, behavioral sciences, academics, and researchers, on the other hand, they tend to work across a broad range of sectors, aiming to understand causes and consequences of human behavior at both the individual and group level, and also to utilize this information to generate positive outcomes in a range of settings. So a common thing that you see with behavioral scientists is consulting with governments to do sort of social interventions and things like this. So very interesting way of applying behavioral sciences. Now, the question of what sort of student psychology is best for versus what student behavioral studies is best for. We would suggest that psychology is best for people who enjoy like really traditional science, lots of statistics, not to scare you away from that, but there is a lot of statistics. People who really enjoy research, people who really want to understand the brain and to understand human behavior and how it relates to the parts of the brain. This is really good for psychology. Now, for behavioral studies, this is really ideal for students who want to explore the mind and behavior in the context of broader sort of social, cultural settings and institutions. The extent to which human behavior is not entirely dictated by the individual. It's almost like moving away from the question of free will is where behavioral studies gets really interesting, because it's all those other things that influence human behavior, and all those other things influenced by human behavior as well. Okay, so just a little bit more in terms of career pathways. I would suggest psychology is the good choice if you want to be a practicing clinical psychologist and or have interest in individual level mental health and therapeutic practices through a kind of traditional medical or biological lens. This program is the only pathway to APA accreditation. Reference here is often made to the 9 colleges or specialties, which are clinical psychology, clinical neuropsychology, community psychology, counseling psychology, educational and developmental psychology, forensic psychology, health psychology, organizational psychology, and sports and exercise psychology. A lot of this stuff does pop up in behavioral studies, but if you want to be doing it in an accredited way, any of this, and you definitely want to go down the psychology pathway. And there's a reason I underlined that statement in the middle of the paragraph there. This is the only pathway to APA accreditation. So if that's your end goal to being a practicing psychologist, you definitely should be looking at the psychology degree. Now, in terms of in terms of career pathways for behavioral studies graduates, it's a really good choice if your interests are more behavioral versus health focused. For example, some of the careers that you see, and this is often a surprise to people, policy advisors and consultants, so people who design interventions. I mentioned this before when I was talking a little bit about political psychology, and yeah, we do a lot to sort of solve issues with intergroup tensions and things like that, designing contact interventions to bring conflicting groups of people together in meaningful and peaceful ways that reestablish the relationships between the two groups. This is kind of my area. All right, so human resource specialists in other forms of organizational psychology. You do see a lot of psychologists in that area. You also see a lot of behavioral scientists in that area. Criminal behavior and policing, some great examples of where you see behavioral studies contributions in these areas. Forensics, so forensic psychology, that's more capital P psychology, but general forensics brings in behavioral studies quite a bit. So the AFP Forensics Command, or the US FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, which is the group that invented the term serial killer and came up with the sort of framework for what that is. That's a behavior analysis unit. So yeah. You also have tactical response. That's another part of where behavioral studies comes in. Game theory can be very helpful there. Also protection operations, intelligence operations, community outreach, which is a big part of policing. That's very good for a behavioral studies graduate. So we have a similar thing with military defense operations, the same areas: tactical response, protection operations, intelligence operations, community outreach. It's very, very important to have a behavioral sciences perspective and all of that. Moving away from the kind of defense and military area, we also see a lot of social researchers. And I don't just necessarily mean in academia, but people who do broader social research, companies who do broader social research. They often bring in behavioral studies experts to design the research, to carry out focus groups, all sorts of elements of it. Market research. This is a huge one that, again, often gets overlooked. And this is on both the sides of advertising and consumer behavior. And I'll throw a third one in there, which is product testing. It really helps to have behavioral scientists with that kind of element as well. But particularly with advertising and consumer behavior, when companies need to figure out new ways to advertise products, they often reach out to behavioral scientists to kind of think, how do we find a new sort of, how do we reframe what we're selling here, so we can tap into new markets. Behavioral scientists is very helpful for that. Also for analyzing consumer trends and things like that. Consumer behavior, very important. And then I also want to mention educational design. And just really quickly, with both of these areas, psychology and behavioral studies, these degrees, particularly if you go on to postgraduate level, open up doors for teaching and research in both of these areas as well. And that is also a really excellent kind of career path within the university framework. As someone who chose that career path, I speak highly for it. I enjoy what I do. Okay, so that does kind of bring us to the end for what I want to talk to you about here today. But we would really love to hear from you if you do have any remaining questions. And usually when you answer one question, you open the door for two more. So if you do want any further information, here are some details on who you can reach out to, get in touch with, and also some information on how to apply for your program. And I really hope to see you soon. Whether you study psychology or behavioral studies, there'll be a place for you to take behavioral studies classes, either as part of your degree, the major part, or as an elective. And I really would hope to see you in there. I hope you make the right choice for your career. And I think either way, you are opening the door to a really interesting journey while at Monash and while studying. And once your undergraduate studies are over, these are two excellent choices, staffed by fantastic academics. And so I kind of want to say you can't really go wrong. All right. Thanks for tuning in. I wish you the best. And again, I hope to see you around. Take care. Bye-bye.